When I was a child, like most Indians, I grew up hearing Gandhi called the Mahatma, the great soul, the saint who freed India with truth and non-violence. His face was on our currency, his names in our very textbooks, his ideas praised in speeches. Back then, the word Mahatma felt untouchable, like it carried an air of unquestionable reverence. But as I grew older and started reading more deeply, I began to see shadows behind that glowing image. Slowly, I started asking myself, did Gandhi truly live up to the name Mahatma? Today, when I think about him, I see a man of contradictions, sometimes noble, sometimes flawed, sometimes deeply troubling. Yes, he was a leader. Yes, he was a thinker. But a Mahatma? No. To me, that word suggests moral perfection, a saintliness above ordinary men. Gandhi, he was not that. He was a politician who mixed idealism with strategy, spirituality with manipulation, compassion with prejudice. And so, when I speak his name, I prefer to call him simply Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi, a man of history, a man of paradoxes who shaped India, but not in my eyes, a Mahatma. Welcome to episode 2 of Shadows and Scripts, where we explore the two faces of Gandhi, a story of light and shadow. I've been thinking a lot about the way we remember our freedom fighters, and honestly, it doesn't sit right with me. We call Gandhi the Mahatma, the great soul, and his birthday, 2nd October, is a national holiday. Everyone knows about it, everyone talks about it. But when I think about the other people who fought for our independence, I can't help but feel there's a huge imbalance. Take Subhash Chandra Bose, Bhagat Singh, Rani Lakshmi Bai. They risked everything for this nation. Yet they are not even remembered. They barely get the same recognition in this popular culture. And in schools, their stories are often summarized in a few sentences. Meanwhile, Gandhi's story is everywhere. I learned that after independence, the government under Jawaharlal Nehru wanted to promote unity and a shared national identity. Gandhi, as the leader of the non-violent movement, symbolized moral leadership, peace, and truth. Declaring his birthday as a national holiday was both a moral and political decision, a way to give the new nation a figure who could unite people across religions, regions, and communities. But that makes me wonder, what about the others? The ones who fought fiercely, sometimes with weapons in hand, who gave their lives for freedom. Their contributions were equally significant. Yet their stories were quietly overshadowed. It's not about disrespecting Gandhi, it's about seeing the bigger picture. True respect for independence means honoring all those who struggled and sacrificed, not, not just the ones chosen by history to be the symbols. So when people call Gandhi Mahatma unquestioningly, I pass. Because freedom was never the work of one man alone. It was a collective struggle. And if we only glorify a few, aren't we doing a disservice to the rest and to the truth itself? The year is 1893. A young lawyer, freshly trained in London, steps onto a train in South Africa. His name Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi. Dressed neatly in a western suit, carrying his legal brief, he takes a seat in the white swanly compartment. Moments later, a railway official approaches. Gandhi insists he has a valid first class ticket, but that does not matter. To the official, he is not a man in suit, not a lawyer, just a colored foreigner. Gandhi refuses to leave, and so he was thrown out shivering on the cold platform of Pietermaritzburg station. That night of humiliation would change him forever. It planted the seeds of resistance. From that injustice was born a leader who would one day wield a new weapon, Satyagraha, the force of truth. In the years that followed, Gandhi mobilized the Indian community in South Africa. He fought against degrading past laws, against restrictions on Indian traders, and against racial discrimination that reduced them to second class citizens. His call was not to pick up arms but to resist peacefully. This was the very beginning of a philosophy that would later inspire Martin Luther King Jr. and Nelson Mandela. But, and here lies the shadow rarely spoken of Gandhi's struggle in South Africa. It was never for everyone. His fight was for Indians, not for Africans. In his petitions to the colonial authorities, Gandhi repeatedly insisted that Indians should not be treated like kafirs, a deeply racist word used for black South Africans. He argued that Indians were civilized, educated, and closer to Europeans in culture. In 1895, he even wrote, "Ours is a struggle to secure for the Indians a place higher than the Kafir." In prisons, he lobbied for separate entrances so that Indians would not be placed alongside the black prisoners. In his own writings, he described Africans as savages and uncivilized. In 1904, Gandhi complained Kafirs are, as the rule, uncivilized. The convicts, even more so. They are troublesome, very dirty, and live like animals. This was not the language of a liberator for all. This was the voice of a man fighting for his community's dignity while reinforcing the very racial order he himself suffered under. Scholars like Ashwin Desai and Ghulam Bahed, in their work The South African Gandhi, argue that Gandhi was less a revolutionary and more a stretcher bearer for empire, loyal to the British crown, which entirely seeks Indian respectability but blind to the African suffering. So, while the world hails South Africa as the birthplace of non-violence, many Africans remember it differently, not as the cradle of equality, but as the stage where Gandhi's own racial prejudices stood exposed. In truth, Gandhi in South Africa was not yet the Mahatma. He was a lawyer fighting for the upward mobility of Indians. Yes, but his vision of justice excluded the millions of Africans who endured the same and often worse oppression. In 1915, after 2 decades in South Africa, Mohandas Gandhi returned to India, but he was no longer the young barrister in a suit. He had shed the clothes of London and chosen a simple dhoti spun with his own hands. When he walked into the villages of Champaran and Kida, people did not see an elite lawyer. They saw one of their own. He lived with the peasants shared their food, listened to their sorrows. At Champaran, the indigo farmers were trapped in crushing contracts, forced to grow crops for planters while their families starved. Gandhi refused to leave until their voices were heard. At Kira, when famine swept the land and the British still demanded taxes, Gandhi urged the villagers to stand firm and refuse payment. In Ahmedabad, during a mill strike, he declared he would fast until the workers received justice. For the first time, the poor felt that someone from the educated class had become their voice. The peasants whispered a new word for him, Mahatma. But as Gandhi's star rose, shadows followed. In his writings, especially Hind Swaraj, he defended the old Varna system, insisting each caste had its duty, the Brahmin to teach, the Kshatriya to protect, the Vaishya to trade, and the Shudra to serve. He denounced untouchability as a stain on Hinduism, yet he did not call for the complete annihilation of caste. Instead, he offered the word Harijan, which means children of God, to describe Dalits. To his followers, this sounded compassionate, but to Dalit leaders like Ambedkar, it was paternalistic, a way of keeping them forever in the role of dependents. Ambedkar accused Gandhi of protecting the very structure that enslaved Dalits. Their clash reached its height in 1932 when Ambedkar demanded separate electorates for his people. Gandhi responded with a fast unto death, forcing Ambedkar into compromise. For many Dalits, that moment was betrayal, a reminder that Gandhi's embrace was not liberation but control. On women too, Gandhi's words rang with contradictions. He praised women as stronger than men, capable of sacrifice in non-violence, yet he preached celibacy even within marriage, condemned contraceptives as immoral, and insisted that lust was poison to the soul. To feminists, this was patriarchal and unrealistic. Historians observed that Gandhi saw women less as equals in power and more as moral guardians. His own experiments in celibacy, where he slept beside young women, including his grandniece, to test his self control, shocked even his admirers, and later drew harsh criticism as exploitative, and so while millions saw Gandhi as Mahatma, the saint who lived among peasants, who gave courage to the weak against empire, others saw limits in his vision. For Dalits, he was the man who denied them separate political power. For women, he was the leader who praised their purity but denied their autonomy. To reformers like Ambedkar, he was less a liberator and more a preacher who could not imagine a world beyond caste and patriarchy. Gandhi had arrived in India as a saint, but even saint cast shadows. His story was already becoming a paradox. The man who gave India a weapon of truth against empire and yet could not free himself from the chains of his own tradition. By the 1920s, Mohandas Gandhi was no longer just a leader. He had become the face of India's freedom struggle. In 1920, he called for a bold new path, the non-cooperation movement. Indians, he urged, should boycott British goods, abandon British-run schools, courts, and councils, and spin their own cloth in defiance. It was not guns, but silence, fasting, and mass withdrawal that he believed could shake an empire. The response was electric. Millions joined, lawyers gave up their practice, students walked out of colonial colleges. Ordinary people who had long felt powerless suddenly discovered that their refusal itself was a weapon. But then, in February 1922, the fire of rebellion leapt beyond Gandhi's control. In the small town of Chauri Chaura, angry protesters clashing with the police set a station ablaze and killed more than 20 police officers. The incident horrified Gandhi. To him, non-violence was not just a strategy but a creed. And so, in one swift stroke, he called off the entire movement. For thousands of revolutionaries, it was like the earth had been pulled from beneath their feet. Young radicals who had risked everything felt betrayed. The British jails were full, yet Gandhi himself had withdrawn. Leaders like Subhash Chandra Bose would later condemn this as weakness, a retreat that broke the momentum of a nation ready to fight. A decade later, Gandhi's name once again circled the globe
Deposits washed
with
up
the
on Davy
Salt
Beach.
March of
Gandhi
1930.
and his protesters
Frail
began
but
to collect
resolute,
small
he
lumps
walked
of natural
240
salt
miles
from the
from his
mud,
ashram to
at the
sea,
same time
lifting a
igniting
pinch of
mass salt
in
protests
defiance
throughout
to the
India,
British monopoly.
including
The
Bombay
image
and
was
Karachi.
unforgettable. One man armed with nothing but his walking stick, daring to confront an empire. Newspapers across the world hailed him as a prophet of peace, a modern day saint. Yet, at home, doubts still lingered. When Gandhi signed the Gandhi Irwin Pact in 1931, agreeing to end civil disobedience in exchange for concessions that many saw as trivial, critics charged him with diluting the struggle. Subhash Chandra Bose argued that Gandhi's compromises again and again clipped the wings of true resistance. To the radicals, Gandhi was not leading a revolution, he was restraining it. But the fiercest storm would come in 1932 with the Pune Pact. Dalit leader B.R. Ambedkar had demanded separate electorates for his people so that Dalits could elect their own representatives without upper caste domination. The British agreed, seeing it as a safeguard for the oppressed. Gandhi, however, saw it as a threat to Hindu unity. He launched a fast unto death inside Yaravada jail, declaring he would rather die than see Hindu society divided. Ambedkar was cornered. He knew that if Gandhi died, Dalits would be branded as the destroyers of Mahatma. Under immense pressure, he signed the compromise, the Pune Pact, which gave reserved seats to Dalits but within the Hindu fold, ensuring upper caste influence remained. For Gandhi's followers, this was a moral victory. For Ambedkar, it was a blackmail. He later wrote bitterly that Gandhi had crushed the rights of the depressed classes by the sheer force of his personality. Thus, while the world admired the frail figure who fought empires with a pinch of salt, many Indians saw another face. A politician who halted revolts, compromised with rulers, and used his moral aura to silence the most oppressed. The paradox deepened. Gandhi, the prophet of non-violence to the world, and Gandhi, the shrewd tactician at home, whose every fast and every pact seemed to bind India together, but often at the cost of those who resisted him the most. It was August 1942. The world was burning in the flames of the Second World War, and India's patience had worn thin. Gandhi, now an old man, gave his final battle cry. Quit India from the steps of the Gavalia tank ground in Bombay. He thundered, "Do or die." The words spread like wildfire. Students walked out of schools, workers struck, offices shut down, and villages erupted in rebellion. For many, this was Gandhi's last and the greatest strike against the empire. The British quickly arrested him, locking him in the Aga Khan palace. To popular memory, this frail prisoner was the man who brought down the Raj with nothing but his moral force. But history, when read more closely, tells another story. Gandhi's stand during the World Wars was riddled with contradictions. In the First World War, he campaigned to recruit Indians for the British Army. To peasants who looked up to him as their champion, He urged, fight for the empire, shed blood for Britain. He even told the gathering in 1918, if we want to learn the use of arms with greatest possible advantage, it is our duty to enlist ourselves in the army. The man of non-violence had become a recruiter for war. When the Second World War broke out, Gandhi at first repeated the same pattern. Before quit India, he wrote to the British Viceroy offering unconditional cooperation in their wars against fascism. His condition was not immediate freedom, but only that India's voice to be heard. To critics, this showed that Gandhi's non-violence bent not towards principle but towards expediency. And when he finally launched Quit India in 1942, his demand was sweeping, but his instructions left no room for debate. Do or die, he told the nation, but only through non-violence, only through his chosen path. Leaders like Subhash Chandra Bose, already in exile, condemned him as authoritarian. Bose argued that Gandhi had turned non-violence from a method into a dogma silencing other strategies like armed struggle. For Bose and the Indian National Army fighting abroad, Gandhi's insistence on one path weakened the national cause. Even within the Congress, younger leaders grumbled. They saw Gandhi's decision as leaving no space for alternatives. Revolutionaries like Jayaprakash Narayan were ready for the bold underground resistance, but Gandhi's strict creed, non-violence, shackled them. The Quit India movement itself was brutally crushed within months. Its leaders jailed, its protests scattered. The British survived the storm, not because they crushed Gandhi's moral power, but because the movement lacked coordination and unity. And then there was his silence moments during the radical sacrifice. When Bhagat Singh was hanged in 1931, millions begged Gandhi to intervene with the British. Gandhi met the viceroy but refused to plead for commutation, saying violence could not be condoned. To many, this confirmed what they feared. Gandhi would never stand with those who chose a different path. Thus, while the world remembers Quit India as the heroic crescendo of Gandhi's life, Indian critics recall the contradictions. The Mahatma, who called on peasants to shed blood for the British in one war, who offered loyalty in another, suddenly demanded do or die when it suited his cause. The prophet of freedom who preached non-violence absolutely that he left no space for those who dared to fight differently. To the globe, Gandhi was the frail old man in prison who toppled an empire. To his critics, he was also the rigid commander whose saintliness masked compromises, silences, and contradictions that shaped and limited the struggle for India's independence. As the Second World War ended and the British prepared to leave, India stood on the edge of freedom, but also on the edge of fire. Across Bengal, Bihar, Punjab, and Delhi, communal tensions exploded. Hindus and Muslims, once bound together in the dream of independence, turned upon each other. Villages burned, trains arrived at stations filled with corpses rather than passengers, and rivers ran red with blood. In the sea of madness, Gandhi moved alone, barefoot, clad only in his dhoti. He walked into torn villages. He had no weapons, no army, only his frail body and his voice. In Calcutta, the city tore itself apart. Gandhi sat in a poor Muslim household, refusing food until Hindus and Muslims laid down their knives. Miraculously, the killing stopped. Lord Mountbatten, the last viceroy, would later call him a one-man army. Again in Delhi, as refugees and rioters filled the streets of vengeance, Gandhi fasted until the mobs dispersed. To millions, these were acts of divine sacrifice. One frail old man doing what governments and soldiers could not. But the critics saw another face. To them, Gandhi's fasts were not miracle but moral blackmail. Hindus and Muslims would halt violence out of guilt. But once the fast ended, the killings returned. His hunger strikes, they argued, were less about reconciliation and more about forcing obedience. Others questioned his very language. Gandhi constantly invoked Ram Rajya, the rule of Lord Ram, as his vision for free India. His morning prayers echoed with Hindu bhajans. To Hindus, this sounded natural, even inspiring, but to Muslims, it signaled bias. Muhammad Ali Jinnah and the Muslim League accused Gandhi of cloaking Hindu revivalism in the garb of nationalism. To them, Congress under Gandhi was never truly neutral. It was tilted towards Hindu culture, and Gandhi's saintliness only masked that reality. And then came the most disturbing shadows of his personal life. In his pursuit of brahmacharya or perfect celibacy, Gandhi conducted what he called experiments. He slept beside young women, sometimes naked, to test his self control. Among them was his own grandniece Manu, barely in her teens. Gandhi insisted these were spiritual trials, but for many they were deeply troubling. Even his close associates like Payara Lal and Nirmal Kumar Bose expressed discomfort. Later scholars from and above all, Gandhi failed to stop the greatest tragedy of all, the partition. As India and Pakistan were carved out in 1947, nearly a million people were slaughtered and 14 million driven from their homes. Gandhi opposed the partition with all his fasting, his pleading, walking from village to village, but his voice, once so powerful, could not silence the hatred. To some, this was his noblest power, the lone figure trying to hold back the tide of blood. To others, it was a proof that his methods had reached their limits. Thus, in his final years, Gandhi stood as both saint and enigma, the man who could calm riots with a fast, yet whose fasting was called a blackmail, the man who spoke of harmony yet alienated Muslims with Hindu symbols, the man revered for purity yet shadowed by disturbing practices in his private life, the man hailed as father of nation yet powerless before the birth of partition, the bloodiest chapter of modern India. In January 1948, when bullets cut him down in Delhi, millions wept. But even in that death, the paradox remained. Gandhi was the conscience of nation and also its most controversial leader, forever caught between the halo of Mahatma and the shadows of the man. On the midnight of 15 August 1947, as Jawaharlal Nehru's voice echoed, at the stroke of the midnight hour, when the world sleeps, India will awake to life and freedom. The globe believed it was Gandhi's triumph. The frail man in lined cloth, armed with nothing but prayer, fasting, and truth, had toppled the greatest empire on earth. School books and foreign histories would later paint it as the victory of non-violence, the proof that moral force could outmatch armies. But behind the halo of Mahatma lay another reality, one even the British admitted. Clement Attlee, the Prime Minister who signed the transfer of power, later confessed during a visit to India that Gandhi's impact on Britain's decision to quit was, in his words, minimal. When pressed further, Attlee listed three true reasons for the sudden retreat of empire. First, Subhash Chandra Bose and the Indian National Army, though militarily defeated, Bose soldiers shook the very foundation of the British rule. Their trials at the Red Fort turned them into martyrs, and more dangerously, they inspired unrest within the Indian armed force themselves. British intelligence reports from 1945 to 46 show growing unease. Indian soldiers no longer trusted their colonial masters unconditionally. Second, the Royal Indian Navy mutiny of 1946, what began in Bombay over poor food and racial abuse, spread like wildfire. Within days, over 20,000 sailors took control of ships, docks and arsenals. Onshore workers and students joined the rebellion. British officers were shocked. Their supposedly loyal forces were openly revolting. Tanks rolled through Bombay to crush the uprising, but the message was clear. The backbone of the empire was cracking. Third, Britain itself was exhausted after two world wars in 30 years. The nation was bankrupt, its economy in ruins. Keeping India chained was no longer financially possible. London faced pressure from America and its own war torn people at home. India was not let go out of generosity but out of necessity. When asked directly how much Gandhi and his campaigns mattered, Attlee dismissed them, even reportedly describing the Mahatma as even minimal, negligible. What mattered most was he emphasized that it was Subhash Chandra Bose and INA which mattered. This admission struck like lightning to Gandhi's critics. It exposed a myth carefully polished over decades. Independence, they argued, was not won by spinning the charkha or fasting under the sun. It was wrested by the fear of armed rebellion, by mutiny within the ranks, and by Britain's own collapse. Gandhi, they said, had been useful in creating international sympathy, but he was not the liberator of the world, believed him to be. Harsh voices went further. Why was it, they asked, that Nehru and Congress rushed to immortalize Gandhi as a father of nation, while leaders like Bose, who raised an army, or the naval mutineers who risked their lives, were sidelined with the national memory? Why did Gandhi receive a national holiday while the anniversaries of other freedom fighters faded into the very silence? Was history written for truth or for the political convenience? Thus, the story of India's independence is double edged. To the world, it was Gandhi's victory, the triumph of soul force, but to critics and even to the British themselves, it was the INA and the mutinies and the imperial weakness that truly broke the Raj. Between the halo of the Mahatma and the blood, fire, and rebellion of others lies the contested truth of the real 1947. On the midnight of 15 August 1947, as Jawaharlal Nehru's voice echoed at the stroke of the midnight hour, when the world sleeps, India will awake to life and freedom. The globe believed it was Gandhi's triumph. The frail man in loincloth, armed with nothing but prayer, fasting, and truth, had toppled the greatest empire on earth. School. On the chilly evening of 30 January 1948, the gardens of Birla House in Delhi were filled with people waiting for their daily glimpse of the Mahatma Gandhi. Frail at 78, walked slowly with the support of his grandnieces. Clad in his simple white dhoti, he folded his hands in greeting. Suddenly from the crowd, Nathuram Godse stepped forward, raising his pistol. He fired 3 shots into Gandhi's chest. The Mahatma fell murmuring what many believed were his last words, Hey Ram. To the grieving nation, his death was martyrdom. Newspapers compared him to Christ, a saint who had sacrificed everything for truth and peace. Leaders declared him the father of the nation, and the world mourned the loss of the apostle of non-violence. But even in the silence that followed his death, a darker voices spoke. For God's sake and his followers, Gandhi was not a saint, but a dangerous politician. In his courtroom speech, Godse accused Gandhi of betraying Hindus by constantly appeasing Muslims. He pointed to Gandhi's fast, like the one in January 1948, that pressured independent India to release 55 crore rupees to Pakistan even as refugees poured into India amid partition. This God said, this was not peacekeeping but surrender, a betrayal that endangered Hindus who had suffered during the partition's horror. Gandhi's death did not silence the debate, but sharpened it. To millions, he was a prophet of peace, a beacon whose voice of conscience had steered India to freedom. To others, he was a flawed politician, at times authoritarian, at times naive, and often divisive. His assassination made him a martyr in the eyes of the world, but at home his legacy remained split, worshipped by some, rejected by others. In the end, Gandhi lived and died as he had always been, a figure impossible to ignore, but equally impossible to see without shadows as well. Thus, Gandhi's story is one of the light and shadow. To the world, he remains the Mahatma, a man who proved that truth and non-violence could confront empires. But in India, memories are more complex. A leader who fought for peasants but upheld caste, who united millions but alienated Dalits and Muslims, who inspired peace but even failed to prevent partition, whose saintly aura overshadowed the decisive role of Subhash Chandra Bose, INA, and the Britain's exhaustion. In the end, Gandhi was neither wholly saint nor wholly evil, but a flawed human whose contradictions shaped the very destiny of this nation. So, on this Gandhi Jayanti, let's all cheer for the man who spun cloth, who spun the nation's imagination, and somehow became the father of the nation without a single official order. Truly a masterclass in self branding, I would say. Happy Gandhi Jayanti, folks.